over the last few years, I've learned a few things about watercolor painting that I wish I'd learned years ago. Things that make my paintings just that much stronger. When you're learning watercolor, you're taught a variety of techniques. The first one possibly being wet and wet, where you would wet down your entire paper or an area of your paper. Starting with a wet surface, you can then take your paint, use a blue, and start painting that, and you can see, of course, because my paper's wet, it immediately starts flowing across my wet surface. And then you can mix in other colors. And this used to be the way I would start all my paintings, is I would start by choosing my areas for my background painting. Dropping in some color, maybe I'm doing a floral painting and I want to put some leaves in, so I'm going to drop in some green, allow it to mingle a bit. Working with fairly light colors because I'll go in later. Like I said, if I were to paint flowers, then maybe I'd put a big pink flower over here. Let those colors kind of blend with the others on the page. And then after it's dry, watercolor always dries lighter than it goes down. Then I would go back in, wait for this to dry completely, go back in and add my details. The problem with painting wet and wet is it's not very precise. You can see immediately my colors start to bleed across the page. I might not control how much they bleed in different areas. If I want to be quite precise, of course, I wouldn't start with this technique. And again, so my big pink flower is turning greener and greener over in this area here as that flows into the pink. The other thing is when you're working with multiple colors like this on a wet surface, the mix isn't always going to be pleasing. If I was painting with blue and yellow, for example, they come together and make green, which is fine unless you're painting a sky, let's say, and you don't want to have green in your sky. So then you're painting wet and wet, you're painting maybe your blue first, wet and wet, and then letting it dry completely, and then painting in your green or your yellow over top, so that once the blue is dried, of course, the yellow won't be able to mix with it. So that was always how I would start a painting. I'd have this lovely background, flowy area, which I like, and I still will, I can still see possibilities in this wet and wet mix. Once it's dry, I can go in and add detail and make quite a pleasing painting out of it. But what I've started liking even more than painting wet and wet like this is starting on dry paper and using a wet and wet technique. I'm going to use a larger sheet this time. Using a wet and wet technique, but starting on a dry surface. And I have a little bit more control and I can have a real lot of fun with this. Let's continue with the whole floral idea. I love to paint florals. I love the organic shapes, the little hints of imperfection in a curled leaf or a bug-eaten blossom petal. Those kind of things make florals really fun for me to paint. So let's say I'm painting a flower, and because I'm painting on dry paper this time, I don't have that bleeding effect. My paint stays right where I put it. But it's not as interesting as painting on a wet surface. So what I can do is after I've painted this wet petal with clean water, I can go in and start introducing some moisture into my other areas of my painting. I can soften that edge. As soon as it's wet, it bleeds out, as you can see. As it dries, it's going to bleed less. And then I can also introduce other colors. Maybe I want some more brilliant color where the petal meets the rest of the flower, something down here. Suddenly I have some beautiful action going on in this painting, in this one single petal. That's really quite interesting to me. I can also tilt my paper a little bit if I want the color to flow in a certain direction. And then because I've started with one petal here, maybe I want to add another. Not a lot of flowers only have a single petal. And now because I've painted a little water here, it's going to already start to bleed a little, but not everywhere. Over here it's still a bit dry. So I still have some control. And the reason when you're painting on a dry paper, you have that control. The paint stays where it's put. And control is nice, but it's not nearly as interesting as the interaction you get between paint and water. So there's a second petal. Because there's some water on the page and some dry areas, I have a real interesting variety of just movement and texture and line. Now I can also take some color, some of this green over here on my palette, and introduce a leaf while I'm painting. I'm trying out a new color today. It's a Daniel Smith Cascade Green. I'm not sure if I'm going to like it or not yet. I noticed it's kind of an opaque color. It made my water cloudy when I cleaned my brush. And I tend to prefer more transparent colors. And so I've got a leaf shape suggested in here. It was quite wet there still, but it was still dry enough here that my paint tended to stay where I put it. It really takes time and practice to learn how wet is too wet, how when to stop and let your painting dry. Here it's dry, so I can add some maybe stem shapes. I'm really just letting my hand kind of flow organically across the page. As I was saying, you really do need to practice with your watercolor to get a sense of how dry is too dry. If you keep painting on an area that's damp, when it already started to dry, you can end up with some really gigantic bloomy edges that you may not have wanted in your painting. If something's too wet, it's going to bleed so much that you're not going to have a defined shape. So you really need to be open to to just allow your painting that time to dry. As you know, the edges have really blended. It's very soft. There are no edges at all. It's very pale as well, so when I go in after this is completely dry, and one way you can tell that it's dry is whether or not it's still cool to the touch. If it still feels cool when you put the back of your hand against it, you know that it's not dry enough yet to paint on. And many paintings have been ruined by painting on them too soon, when they were still wet, still damp and looked dry, but weren't quite there yet. So I can go in and add further layers and edges, but this is going to take a lot of time to complete. Whereas this piece, which I just did using my introducing water after method, I don't even know what to call it. It's you are painting on dry paper, so it is wet on dry, and then you're introducing water almost immediately, which gives you that wet and wet, that flow. But just a lot more control. And already there's areas of this painting that I really like that I won't have to do a lot with to give them that voice, to give them a finished look. I can take, for example, a little bit of yellow here. This is the new Gamboge, which is my favorite yellow. I'll blend that around a little bit too. The more water you add, the more room it has to flow and blend and really get soft. If you're painting an area and you only add a little bit of water just up against the edge, for example, if I just went alongside this area and then stopped, it still has a boundary. That's still going to mean that pink or crimson is going to stop where the water stops. But if I kept adding water, cleaning my brush, getting more clear water, and working it out, the sky's the limit as to how far those colors can go. And they'll get gradually lighter and lighter and lighter until there's no line at all. It's just this invisible fading right out to nothing. So how much water you add is going to make a difference as to how much blending goes on. And again, that makes and because I took only this side with water and left the color, this edge is nearly dry. I have a nice, interesting, crisp line right there, which I kind of like, and I think I'm going to leave. I really like that Because I love the transparency of watercolors so much, I don't want to have paintings where I've layered and layered and layered and layered. I don't want to work a painting to death and lose all that beautiful flow and transparency. So the more beautiful line and color and edge that I can introduce in the very first stages of a painting, the more vibrant my paintings are going to be, the more free, the more interesting, the more fun and full of life. So I'm loving this technique. I feel like I have a lot more control than I ever had before, and I hope that you'll try it too. I'd love to see how it works for you, and maybe you'll find your own expression in this fun technique.